Hello and welcome. We're starting again today another series of devotionals, and as we've been doing for several months now, I began this as kind of a temporary way of kind of filling in the gaps, but it's becoming kind of a regular staple for a lot of us. I say for me, I enjoy doing it, and I hope they're continuing to be a blessing to you. Over the last couple of weeks, if you've been with us, we've been talking about the story of the prodigal son, or as I often say more accurately, the prodigal father. And we have in this story really three main characters. We have the father, who is a good and gracious man of amazing patience towards his really irresponsible and unthankful son, who basically said he wanted to forsake his family, he wanted to forsake his faith, and he wanted to go live in a foreign land. This was really considered to be the most reprehensible thing a person could do in that day and age, especially for a good Jewish family. But it was also really the one thing that most parents feared would happen with one of their children, that they would be drawn away after the desires and pleasures of this secular world, the Gentile world, which was all around them. And here it was, this father's worst nightmare came to pass. His son went away and took his fortune or his portion of the inheritance, wasted it until there was nothing left. And then we have, of course, the return of the son. So these are the first two, and maybe in many ways primary characters. But what's interesting is we often overlook the third character, which is the older brother. I love the painting by Rembrandt of the prodigal son. I saw it for the first time in the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, Russia. I've never been so up close to a masterpiece as I was there. There was very little protection that was provided for it. But what was so interesting is that when you get really close to the painting, you could only see the brush strokes. But when you step back, you realize that Rembrandt had created a whole atmosphere in this one piece of canvas. And it's interesting because it has the father with his son kneeling down, asking for his forgiveness. And you have some servants standing around. But in the background, there's this shadowy figure looking on. And according to Rembrandt, that was the older brother. That unlike the father who ran to meet his son and put a robe on him and put a signet ring on his finger and had servants put sandals on his feet, which was basically a sign of importance. Not everybody had sandals on their feet. Most people walked around barefoot. And he did all of these things in an effort to show his compassion and forgiveness, but also to try to restore his son that had fallen. And that's the thing I think is really important, because sometimes people fall and we kind of just dismiss them as having failed. Even if they come back to the church, we're kind of closed in our hearts towards them. We're kind of cautious. And yet every effort was made by this father to restore his son. And I think Jesus was trying to say something very important to us, that the Father in heaven doesn't look at us dismissively when we fail, but he does everything in his power and our willingness to be restored to the place where we once were fruitful in the things of the kingdom. But also secondarily, he's telling us that we as a church need to do the same thing. When we have friends and family and others who fall away from the faith, we should do everything we can to try to set the ship right in their life, to help them get back on their feet and affirm them, as Paul would say to the Corinthians, that we need to affirm our love for them, because Paul put it this way in 2 Corinthians 2, he says, we are not ignorant of Satan's devices. And what are his devices? Well, some of them include shame, guilt, reproach, and all of the rest. And so we need to make sure that we affirm our love to someone, just as the father did in this story. And that's where we really kind of get juxtaposed to the father, is this older brother who is indignant by his father's actions. And in part, it kind of makes sense, because when the father kills the fatted calf, one commentator made this interesting note. It was probably a calf that was being fattened for the son's wedding. And here his father had taken what had been set aside for the older son, and he spent it on, basically spent it on his ne'er-do-well son. And I love the father's response. He says, we must rejoice. We must rejoice, because your brother who was lost has now been found. And that became really the great creative line of the most popular Christian song ever, called Amazing Grace. I was lost, but I was found. I was blind, but now I see. I was dead, but now I'm alive. Well, this is what the father says to the older brother about his younger brother who had been restored to the family. And then he said something really interesting to me. He said, "Son, everything I have is yours." In other words, when the younger son wanted his portion of the inheritance, being two sons, that would have been 1/3. The older son would have had 2/3 of the inheritance. The father was saying to the older son, "Listen, everything that I have will be yours at my death. You'll inherit all that I have. Your younger son has wasted his fortune. He will never get that fortune back except he earns it on his own." But he says, what you're missing in all this is not that my loving him is taking something away from you. My loving him adds something to you, and including, importantly, I'm adding your son back into your brother back into your life, that you might be made whole, that you may be restored. One of the things the prophet said, that God would turn the hearts of the sons back to the fathers, and of the fathers back to the son. Family relationships are central and foundational to our lives and to our existence. When they become broken or separated, we've lost something invaluable. And it's something to pray, God, restore to me those relationships. I just wonder, are you estranged or bitter or resentful towards a family member, and that's caused a separation and a break? Don't just dismiss it and say, well, you can choose your friends, you can't choose your family, and therefore I don't have to pay any attention. It's really important that we step back and say, Lord, help me to restore that relationship. Help us to find that healing and unity. And if it's possible, because there has to be a willingness on all sides, but if it's possible, God will hear that prayer and he'll do some great and exciting things in your life. Well, I hope this gives you something to think about today as you go about all the busy things you have to do. And I just want you to know, my prayer is that God would strengthen you and encourage your heart in seeking him and living for him, and maybe even in finding ways to restore broken relationships in your life. God bless you, and go in his grace.